Thank you very much, and it is my honor to be here and my pleasure to address you. I'm going to take a slightly an angle which is a little bit different, perhaps from the previous one, although very much connected to many of the points you raised, and it is about policy and global governance of our natural resources. I don't think I need to tell this audience that the planet is in the red, and I don't think I need to remind you about all the indicators and the health of the planet and the way they unfortunately are still not going in the right direction. But one thing that I hope you would agree with me is that in the last perhaps decade or so, perhaps even less, although we knew a lot of things from before, but today the big difference is that we actually really know what's going on. We know what the problems are. We know, frankly, what the solutions are in most cases. And we know that we enter a stage where we are altering the biosphere at an unprecedented rate. Many of your colleagues, yourself, all of us talk about the great acceleration of natural resources, all this happening in a few decades, and basically a blink of an eye compared to the history of nature and life on the planet. We know that we're warming the atmosphere, we know that we are in fact warming the ocean even faster, and we know that we are trapped into a cycle, a vicious cycle of in order to produce food and a few other commodities, and in order to produce energy to some extent, we're clearing and converting huge areas of natural land and destroying also large areas of the ocean, with the effect of altering all the ecosystem services that these habitats provide, warming the atmosphere and the ocean, and the effect is becoming more and more visible. Nature is telling us very simply, and perhaps the ultimate indicator of all this is the biodiversity indicators. Whether you look at extinction rates, as you very well know, whether you look at population decline, the figures are astonishing. And when you go into the details of these figures, they are becoming even more incredibly worrying. We also know what the drivers are of this, and the latest TIP-BESS report is very clear about that. Habitat conversion is the #1. Climate change is surging as a very important dimension. Then other issues like unsustainable use and alien species come next. This is not just about decline of wildlife. There is also a human dimension. The previous speaker really highlighted very well the challenge that I'm going to touch base again later on. You may have seen this picture before. This is an amazing, this has been considered the most amazing selfie ever done by anyone on the planet. These are 2 rehabilitated gorillas in a Virunga National Park, and it's a beautiful story of human empathy and care. But there's the dark side. The dark side is that one of these 2 guys last week was shot dead by a poacher. So there is a human dimension about nature conservation, which is just not about species, but it is about human beings as well. To put it very simply, in a super simple child language, the ecological challenge of today has got 2 facets, 2 sides of the same coin. Climate change on one hand, and nature loss, the alteration of the natural systems on the other. And of course, we've been treating these 2 issues too separately until now. We need to move into a much more integrated approach. We know that. We know, in fact, that right now, the vicious circle is that by degrading nature, we exacerbate climate change, and climate change is affecting further erosion of nature and living systems, and we need to move away from that, where actually protecting nature is part of the solution to climate change, and vice versa, as supporting the resilience of natural systems. The very exciting thing, and I'm very glad it was mentioned the word hope, because I think in so many years in conservation, many of us have been, I don't know you, but I definitely feel more, perhaps even optimistic than ever before. And simply because we're actually beginning to get it. We are really beginning to understand the consequences of what's happening. And this is not just anymore a moralistic issue alone. It's actually beginning to be considered and felt as an existential, as a survival issue. Pollution perhaps has been the most important dimension of all this. We've been polluting our environment for a long time, but in the recent years, this has been probably the alarm bell that triggered a lot of response in the population. In fact, countries like India, China, big champions now of the fighting climate change, wasn't climate change the trigger, it was actually pollution. The polls or the images that we have about plastic pollution that's becoming a super crisis, and the costs of nature loss and climate change are beginning to also be accounted for. So all this is in a state pressure and response system analysis. While the state of the planet continue to degrade, while the pressures on the planet continue to grow, the exciting thing, the hopeful thing, is that the response is also growing. Perhaps the incredible acceleration of the clean energy revolution is the most clear signal of that response. And it is happening. It's not happening fast enough, we know, but it is happening, and it is happening in the climate sphere, which is exciting and very, very hopeful. But we're beginning also to understand the broader concept of the natural systems being the foundation of everything else. And if you want, looking at the SDG framework, you can look at the biosphere targets in the SDGs, life on land, life underwater, so the ocean, climate, fresh water, being really the foundation for a healthy society and a healthy economy. That kind of paradigm is beginning to sink into policymaker and decision maker and the public as well. And our challenge is that simple. It's about bending these two curves, if you like. Bending the curve of emissions on one hand, downward, and we're beginning to do that, as you know, slowly, and bending the curve of biodiversity loss, nature loss, upward. And we're not there yet on that one. So this is actually one of the old G7, but climate change has risen now to the top of the political agenda. There is little doubt about that. There are deniers, notable deniers, but is there. It's discussed as a major societal issue, major political issue, major economical issues. And then in The Guardian, a year ago, you had this article that goes with the title that for me exemplifies the challenge we're facing with nature. Nature loss is still not relevant enough. You cannot find anybody happy because the panda is going extinct. Everybody's quite disturbed and sad and disappointed, but it's not enough. It's not enough to trigger the change of behavior that we need to trigger to actually bend that curve upwards. And this is the same picture that was presented earlier. I was struck like you were, but it was just so true in many ways, something we experience all the time. You know, biodiversity and climate change is relevant, you can tell. Biodiversity is there, but stable as a minor concern. But something is happening. And something is happening right now, which I think as a community we should not miss the opportunity to capitalize on. This is the new Guardian. I showed you the previous Guardian paper, right? Here it is. And this is last week. Loss of biodiversity is just as catastrophic as climate change. Of course, this is Robert Watson, the chair of IBES. But I'm sure you've seen this all over the places. BBC front page, they put the IBES report headline even before the royal baby birth as a major topic. It is beginning to resonate with society. And this is the first time in my life, in my career as a conservationist, where a report on nature loss has actually hit the front pages of almost all printed newspapers in many, many countries. Extraordinary. This is an opportunity we have to capitalize on. And the G7, the previous G7 was not talking about biodiversity at all, only climate. The next G7 in August, hosted by France, will have biodiversity and climate together as an integrated agenda as part of the top priorities. So, biodiversity as the best-kept secret to the Sustainable Development Agenda is beginning to actually break free, it's beginning to grow in relevance, and the narrative is beginning to be about nature being fundamental to our development and the risks of losing nature versus the benefits of conserving it. This is really something that we've been dreaming of for decades, and finally, I think, society is beginning to get it. And perhaps we should be also, communication terms, be a little bit more holistic when we talk about nature. WWF is guilty as charged. We've been pushing all the time iconic species because they resonate emotionally with people. Actually, biodiversity is also the little stuff. Biodiversity is the pollinators, not just bees, by the way. It is the fish that we eat. It is so much more that provide services to us. When people look at the forest, they too often forget this is a web of life from thousands of species and millions of individuals that make these things work and produce all the benefits that were mentioned earlier. And of course, biodiversity in nature is fundamental to allow traditional lifestyles as well. Now, 2020. 2020, I'm sure you know, it is a special year for sustainable development. It's a year where the world will focus on sustainable development goals, the first targets will expire. It's a year where the United Nations on climate change, framework on climate change, the Paris Agreement will be tested with the national determined contributions that countries will put together forward, and we'll see where we're heading. And the Convention on Biological Diversity is rather cryptic title that nobody really understands what it is, apart from us. It should be renamed, I think, the Convention on Nature, like Paris was the Convention on Climate, really. But that convention will reach a super important moment of renewal of all its target for 2030. It basically will set the next decade agenda for nature conservation. Can we think of a Paris moment for nature in 2020? Can we think of that convention that, by the way, is going to be hosted by China, a country that is not taking international conventions lightly, and they really committed to see a success out of this event? Can we take this as the opportunity to build on this growing awareness, to build on the ecological crisis of natural systems, and really seal a deal? We call it a new deal for nature and people, like the deal for climate in Paris. Sir David Attenborough at Davos spoke in the plenary for the first time in the history of Davos about nature loss and climate change. And he mentioned in very simple words, like he greatly does all the time. We know there is a problem. We need a plan. That's the plan. In 2020, we have the chance to develop a plan that has a vision very clearly about reversing and protecting and restoring nature, a plan that is about an ambition that has to be short-term. It cannot be too far in the future. It has to follow the decade-long targets of CBD, so 2030. And has to be a deal with clear targets, clear, measurable, communicable targets. What these targets could be, can we resemble in any way something like the 2 degrees for climate for nature? What would be that target? What would be the target that did what the 2 degrees did for climate, coalescing the whole world, focusing all the efforts, giving a point of reference, an ambition for achieving a more stable climate? We think that one target is not going to be possible for nature. It's too complex. But perhaps a couple of or just 3 targets could be possible. High level, understandable, communicable, and measurable. One about biodiversity, one about land and sea spaces, and one about footprint. And in other words, that could be about a serious commitment to halt the level of extinction rates of today. And that will break down into wedges like wildlife trade and sustainable use and invasive species and so on. A solid target about stopping to lose nature at the rate that we're losing today, on land and in the ocean. We know that on land we're left about 50% of the planet in natural state. Can we hang on to that? Can we commit to maintain that level of natural spaces, coverage of the planet? Not just in terms of protected areas, but in terms of protected areas, restoration agenda, and sustainable management. Obviously including, I think, a major opportunity to engage local communities and indigenous knowledge and practices. And then the really difficult one, perhaps, but super important, super exciting, because we know that protecting the natural spaces is super important, but not enough. How can you green the drivers of current nature loss? How can we green key sectors like agriculture? How can you green sectors like fisheries, infrastructure, extractives, and try to attack the current model of production and consumption that we know is driving not only nature loss in the wild places through conversion today, but also loss of biodiversity and services in productive landscapes. And all these high-level targets that then should be broken down in a proper implementation plan, country by country, justified by a narrative that is not just about a moral imperative, which is super important, to coexist with the diversity of life that we found on the planet, but also a utilitarian, if you like, narrative for our own sake, for our own survival, for our own health and prosperity and happiness. And so a set of targets and a deal for nature and people that is about diversity of life, but also is about a stable climate, is about food security, is about water security, and all the benefits that nature provides to us. So this is, in a nutshell, we know, the challenge of living in harmony with nature, and we believe that 2020 is a fantastic opportunity that we cannot miss. In order not to miss that opportunity, we need first to converge as a movement around a clear narrative, a clear ask, and then begin to build a movement of champions, governments, business, society. We're working already with a number of organizations. I hope this group could also join forces, and many of your organizations around this conference join forces to really converge and align as much as we can and co-design this objective altogether, but particularly move into building the momentum and that set of champions. They're going to be critical in 2020 to really agree on a new deal, transformational as the Paris Agreement, perhaps even clearer, even more ambitious, and even more committal in terms of implementation mechanism. So that's our dream for 2020. Is a sprint, is a difficult one. We have only 18 months, but the momentum is there, and we continue to feel it. So as you said earlier, we are very, very hopeful. Thank you very much.